I am truly relieved, and I'll tell you, it's about time. It really is.
It was nearly 4 decades ago that Stan and Julie Patz sent their 6-year-old son Etan to the bus stop in New York City by himself.
Etan simply disappeared.
They would never see him again.
New at noon, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office is asking the Supreme Court to review the Etan Patz murder case. A federal appeal court ordered a new trial or the release of Pedro Hernandez last month.
Pedro Hernandez had been serving a sentence of 25 years to life for killing Etan Patz. He had confessed in 2012, but his attorneys at the time questioned his mental fitness. Now an appeals court says an issue involving a jury note in 2017 means Hernandez didn't get a fair trial.
In 1979, 6-year-old Etan Patz disappeared on his walk to the school bus. Recently, the man once convicted of his murder was told he might be a free man. Now the question remaining is, will he walk free or will he stay behind bars? Hi, I'm Katie Ring, true crime analyst, self-defense instructor, and fierce advocate for victims. And this is Crime House Daily, your weekday true crime companion, a Crime House original powered by Pave Studios. We follow the cases making headlines now, where justice is still unfolding. This is a Night Watch episode bringing you today's biggest crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel at Crime House Daily so you never miss an episode. This episode discusses active criminal cases and breaking news. The information we share is based on what's publicly available at the time of recording and may change as new evidence comes to light. We aim to inform, not to decide guilt or innocence, so everyone mentioned is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Tonight, we're revisiting one of the most haunting cases in American history, the disappearance of 6-year-old Etan Patz, who was one of the first missing kids featured on milk cartons after he vanished in 1979. Decades later, Pedro Hernandez was convicted of his murder. But this summer, a federal appeals court overturned the conviction and believed he should get a new trial. Now, New York prosecutors are asking the U.S. Supreme Court to reinstate the verdict, setting the stage for yet another battle in a case that forever changed how America searches for missing children. Our case tonight is one that sparked the national missing children's movement and what led to the practice of printing photos of missing kids on the sides of milk cartons in the 80s and 90s. The disappearance of 6-year-old Etan Patz. For years, it was one of the world's most notorious cold cases, until a man named Pedro Hernandez was convicted of murdering Etan in 2017. But this summer, it started heating up again because the conviction was overturned on appeal due to the jury receiving improper instructions. However, prosecutors in New York City recently announced that they are asking the Supreme Court of the United States to restore the conviction. So this story is far from over. But how did we get here? Let's go back to 1979 in New York City's Soho neighborhood. Today, Soho is flooded with nice restaurants, designer clothing stores, and insanely expensive apartments. But back in 1979, it was a little grittier with less designer labels, more makeshift galleries and industrial spaces, and no plumbing. It was the heart of the boho artist scene, perfect for a professional photographer like Stan Patz and his young family. Stan, his wife, Julie, and their 3 kids, Shira, Etan, and Ari, lived at 113 Prince Street. Stan and Julie had met in college at the University of Massachusetts. After they graduated, they moved to New York, got married, and moved into a tiny apartment in the city when their daughter Shira was born in 1970. They were looking for a place with more room and decided to buy a loft in Soho in 1971. A year later, Etan was born and Ari arrived 4 years later. By the time Etan was 6, he was attending school at PS3. He was happy there and loved learning. Etan was an outgoing and gentle kid. He only saw the good in others and had a hard time even understanding the concept of evil. Etan was definitely a city kid. He wanted to do things by himself. And one afternoon, after a shopping trip in the village just north of Soho, Etan asked his mom if he could walk through Washington Square Park alone. Kids ran around the city unsupervised way more frequently than they do today. It was just the way things were. No one thought for a minute that someone might actually take or harm a child. So Julie agreed to let Etan stroll through the park on his own. But she walked along the perimeter, never taking her eyes off her son. Etan must have loved the experience because on May 25th, 1979, 6-year-old Etan asked if he could walk to the bus stop by himself. The stop was at West Broadway and Prince, which was only a block and a half from the Patz apartment. It was just before 8 in the morning, and Julie considered the circumstances. Her oldest child, Shira, was dragging her feet, trying to stay home from school that day. Meanwhile, her youngest son, Ari, was 2 and had a friend over from the night before, so they were up and running around. Julie walked Etan downstairs and saw everyone she usually saw on the street that morning, so she figured it was better to let Etan walk the block and a half to the bus by himself than leave Ari and his friend alone to wreak havoc on the apartment. She kissed Etan goodbye and watched for just a couple of seconds as her son, in a black cap, blue jacket, blue jeans, and blue sneakers, walked towards the bus stop at West Broadway. Moments later, he disappeared into the morning bustle of Prince Street. A neighbor and the mailman would later say they saw him at the corner of Prince Street and Wooster, just a block from the bus stop. But they're the only ones who reported seeing Etan after he left his home. By 3:30 that afternoon, Etan hadn't returned home from school, so Julie called a neighbor in a panic. That neighbor asked her daughter if she had seen Etan after school. The girl said no, Etan hadn't even come to school at all, which raised the question, how is Julie just finding this out hours later? First, a new driver was on Etan's bus route. He'd left the stop 10 minutes early, with only 6 kids on the bus instead of the usual 24, and he had no idea because he was new. So when the parents of the 18 kids who'd been left behind showed up a few minutes later, they probably just figured Etan was one of the few children who had made it onto the bus. Then there was Etan's teacher. She noticed he wasn't there and didn't alert anyone. But she wasn't expected to. She taught in a crowded public school where parents weren't generally notified if a kid wasn't there. It was just assumed they were likely sick at home. So by the time Julie Patz found out her son was missing, it had been almost 8 hours since anyone had seen him. I can't imagine what that realization must have been like for her. It's a parent's worst nightmare. Julie immediately called the police, and the NYPD deployed nearly 100 officers and bloodhounds to look for Etan. The search quickly grew from there, soon involving helicopters, boats on the East and Hudson rivers, Transit Authority Police, and Port Authority Police. In the first 2 weeks of the investigation, 500 officers were assigned, both full and part-time, to Etan's case. Neighbors cooperated with police, allowing their apartments to be upended and searched. Since Stan Patz was a professional photographer, he had clear portrait-style photos of his son. These pictures of Etan were printed out on flyers, and those flyers soon papered the entire city. They were even projected onto screens in Times Square. But the initial investigation didn't produce a ton of leads. At first, police focused on a handyman named Othniel Miller. He had a workshop in his basement only a few buildings down from the Patz, and had known Etan from around the neighborhood. The day before Etan's disappearance, Othniel had given him $1, which made the authorities wonder if he had an interest in Etan. Othniel was questioned, but there was no evidence to make an arrest. And over the next few years, they couldn't find any other credible suspects. But the national conversation around missing and abducted children had now forever been changed. Parents were drilling the concept of stranger danger into the minds of their kids. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan designated May 25th, the anniversary of Etan's disappearance, as National Missing Children's Day. The following year, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was established. But for the most part, everyday life moved on for most people in the Patz Soho neighborhood. But Etan's family woke up every day to the cold reality that they still had no answers as to what happened to Etan, and they may never get any. But then in 1985, 6 years after Etan's disappearance, a lead with real promise finally emerged, in the form of a man named José Ramos. At the time of Etan Patz's disappearance in 1979, José Ramos had been living in a basement of a tenement on East 4th Street, about a mile from where the Patz family had lived. Ramos had also dated one of the Patz neighbors, a woman named Susan, who would also sometimes walk Etan to the bus stop. In the original search for Etan, Ramos wasn't identified as a suspect. But in 1982, 3 years after Etan disappeared, he was detained by police for stealing books from kids. By that point, he was living in a drainage pipe in a park in the Bronx. Cops searched the drain pipe and found photos of young boys. None of them were Etan, but several looked like him. When they questioned Ramos, he admitted that he knew who Etan was, and that the woman he'd been dating when Etan disappeared sometimes took care of him. Ramos admitted that on the day of Etan's disappearance, he'd spoken to a blonde kid that matched Etan's description, then took him back to his apartment to rape him. But he didn't identify Etan as being that boy, and there was no physical evidence to tie Ramos to Etan's disappearance. However, it was enough to keep him on the authorities' radar. And when Assistant United States Attorney Stuart Grabois took over the case in 1985, he identified José Ramos as a strong suspect. He was tracking other leads at first, but Grabois eventually questioned Ramos in 1988. This time, Ramos told Grabois that he was 90% sure that Etan was the boy he'd abducted that day, and his criminal history certainly made it seem likely. Grabois found out that Ramos had traveled around the country in a bus trying to lure boys onto it. These discoveries led to Ramos being convicted of a separate molestation charge in Pennsylvania in 1990 and sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. But there was no physical evidence linking him to Etan's disappearance. However, Grabois and his team considered him the prime suspect. By June of 2000, investigators still hadn't given up hope of finding their smoking gun. They searched the basement where Ramos had been living back in 1979, the tenement on East 4th Street. He'd supposedly told a fellow inmate that the basement was where he buried Etan. They dug it up and found nothing. A year later, in June of 2001, Etan Patz was officially declared dead. His father, Stan, said that in the years immediately following Etan's disappearance, he'd have fantasies where a cab would pull up in front of their apartment and Etan would come out. But as the years went on, those fantasies faded as reality set in. His son was never coming home. There wasn't enough evidence to charge José Ramos with Etan's murder, but the Patz still could proceed with a civil suit against him for wrongful death. And in 2004, he was found liable by default, and Julie and Stan Patz won a $2 million judgment. But Ramos didn't have that kind of money, so the Patz never saw a dime of that. In the meantime, the authorities kept working on Etan's case. And in 2010, Manhattan elected a new district attorney, Cyrus Vance Jr., who never really believed that there was solid proof that José Ramos had killed Etan. So Vance took the investigation in another direction. 2 years later, in April of 2012, investigators revisited Othniel Miller, the handyman who knew Etan from the neighborhood. The NYPD, with the help of the FBI, dug up the basement in Miller's apartment building, which was on the same street where the Patz lived. The dig turned up nothing. Miller was finally officially cleared once and for all. It was starting to look like Ramos had really killed Etan. But that was before an unexpected phone call came into the NYPD. A man named Jose Lopez called the police after seeing footage of Othniel Miller's basement being dug out on the news. He believed they were on the wrong track. The man told police he thought his brother-in-law might be involved with Etan's disappearance and murder. He was a guy named Pedro Hernandez, and until this point, he hadn't been identified as a possible suspect. Back in 1979, Hernandez was an 18-year-old high school dropout, working as a stockboy at a bodega on West Broadway and Prince, the intersection where Etan's bus stop was. After Etan vanished, which was possibly within days of the disappearance, Hernandez quit his bodega job and returned to his hometown of Camden, New Jersey. Detective notes from the initial 1979 investigation revealed that they knew Hernandez worked at the bodega, but that's it. It's unclear if he was ever questioned at the time, but maybe he should have been. By the early 1980s, Hernandez started telling a few people that he had killed a kid in New York. First, he told someone from his church while on a religious retreat. Then he told his entire church prayer group. Then he told a friend, although in this confession, he claimed the victim was Black. He even confessed to his former wife before they were married, but because Hernandez used the word muchacho to describe the boy, she thought he was talking about a teenager, not a 6-year-old child. Eventually, his brother-in-law found out about it. And when the police questioned Pedro Hernandez on May 23, 2012, he confessed to killing Etan Patz. On May 23, 2012, NYPD detectives went to New Jersey to question Pedro Hernandez about Etan Patz, just 2 days before the 33rd anniversary of Etan's disappearance. After several hours of questioning, Hernandez finally broke down. He told police that on May 25, 1979, he saw 6-year-old Etan waiting for the bus outside the bodega where he worked. He asked Etan if he wanted to come into the bodega's basement to get a soda. Hernandez said that once he got Etan into the basement, he attacked the little boy. He told investigators he grabbed him by the neck and choked him. Hernandez claimed Etan was still alive when he put him in a garbage bag, then put the bag in a box. He said he then hoisted the box up onto his shoulder, walked to the next corner, and dumped the box into the trash about a block away from the bodega. This was enough for Pedro Hernandez to be placed under arrest. Once he was in custody, Hernandez agreed to show investigators where he'd lured Etan into the basement, then where he'd dumped the body. The rest of Hernandez's family was questioned, and investigators learned that he'd been telling people about attacking Etan for years, and it was somewhat of an open secret in their family. In January of 2015, Pedro Hernandez went on trial for the murder of Etan Patz. His attorney, Harvey Fishbein, argued that Hernandez was mentally ill, and because of that, his confession wasn't credible. Fishbein said that his client's illness made him make up the whole story about Etan. One example Fishbein pointed to was how Hernandez claimed he'd seen Etan waiting for the bus that morning in 1979. But all the parents who knew Etan from the bus stop never reported seeing him there. Fishbein insisted that investigators took advantage of Hernandez's illness and limited intellect and coerced him into a confession. Meanwhile, the prosecution countered that Hernandez was not mentally ill, that he had no record of mental illness and could be seen on home videos socializing and appearing to be fully cognizant. The jury was facing a tough decision. They deliberated for 18 days, but couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. So the judge declared a mistrial. 1 year later, in 2016, Hernandez was tried again. Only this time, the jury was able to come to a unanimous decision. They found Pedro Hernandez guilty of kidnapping and murdering Etan Patz. For these crimes, he was sentenced to 25 years to life. Etan's parents are convinced that Hernandez is the killer and drop their civil judgment against José Ramos. But the story doesn't end there. Hernandez appealed his conviction, continuing to argue that he was inhibited by mental illness. His confession was coerced, and there was absolutely no physical evidence tying him to the murder of Etan Patz. The case worked its way through the legal system for the next 8 years, until July of 2025, when federal appeals court overturned Pedro Hernandez's conviction. This decision had to do with the confession Hernandez made before his arrest and before he'd been read his Miranda rights. In the 2017 trial where Hernandez was convicted, the jury had asked what to do with that pre-Miranda confession. They wanted to know if they decided that this confession was involuntary, if they should then disregard the 2 videotaped confessions that came after his rights were read. In that instance, the judge said the answer is no and gave no further explanation. So Hernandez's confessions were considered as evidence and Hernandez was convicted. But the appellate judges on the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals who reviewed the case felt differently. They decided that the state trial court had disregarded established federal law. They ordered that Hernandez be freed or retried as a result of this overturned conviction, which means that once again, Etan Patz's murder is considered unsolved. As of this recording, Etan's parents, who moved out of their home in Soho in 2019, haven't publicly commented on Hernandez's conviction being overturned. But the prosecutors in New York City remain convinced that Pedro Hernandez killed Etan. On September 15, 2025, they announced that they asked the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals to hold off on enforcing its decision while they take the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. As of this recording, this process is still in motion. We'll be tracking this case closely, and as always, we'll bring you major updates as they come in. What did you think of tonight's case? Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments. You stay curious, and I'll stay on the case. See you next time. If you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Crime House Daily and follow us on social media at CrimeHouse247 for real-time updates, because the pursuit of justice never stops.